greetings.
Hi, Andy. Can you hear me all right?
Hey, how are you?
Hi, how are you?
Good, you record right away. Oh my gosh.
These are bad glasses. These aren't a whole lot better, but this is not going to be in it, right?
Hi, Andy.
How are you?
Reasonably well.
Doing well. How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Just do it.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Andy?
I'm hanging in there. Welcome to Conversations with Writers, a retrospective. I'm Andy, I'm a writer, and to celebrate 2 years of doing the Conversations with Writers series, I want to showcase some of my favorite pieces by the writers we've interviewed over the last 12 months and talk about some of the things that draw me to these works. I've left timestamps and links to the texts in the video description box so you can view, purchase, and skip around as you choose. That's it for housekeeping. Now, on to the reading. This is called Barrier, and it's one of Talley Kayser's award-winning poems. Each night, I stretch my muscled arc beside a man who teems with life, whose need reshapes me daily. Narrow islands clasp our coastline like a string of pearls, but the gaps between them seethe with teeth, waves breaking. How the ocean hungers. He swells, recedes, he draws me closer, prizing all I shed. Small secrets and odd bits of scent churn in the space between us. Twice each day, the rising tide gluts creeks, twice daily, ebbs. Low tide, rivers lengthen, run to tongue the sea, rough oysters rise and cast damp shadows. He wove marsh grass from my hair, he shaped crab shells from my toenail clippings. Out of a bit of my spittle flew a great white bird, long-necked, with rowing wings. Life is abundant in these protected waters. In return, I brace my spine against great storms. Barrier islands guard the coast against disasters. For more information, see lash, pummel, batter, hammer, flay, pound, wreck, pelt, scour, and obliterate. Also, wind, wave, surge, gale, hurricane. Such is my gift. Whatever comes, I bear it. Love, I offer you my shelter. So one of the things that I really admire about this poem is its shape. I think that's something that Talley is an expert in. She has so much experience with a vast array of landscapes. Talley is someone that can kayak down a river and be ready to scale a mountainside cliff immediately after. So Talley is someone that has the ability to navigate virtually any kind of terrain. So why would the terrain of the page space be any different? What works in nature tends to also work on the page. And I think that's one of the things that Talley is really brilliant at when it comes to poetry, is knowing how to shape. In this particular poem, it ebbs down the page. It's not, everything is not left hand perfectly aligned. We get a bit of movement. It's really difficult to know what the limitations are of pushing that movement, that unconventional movement down the page before we start to lose our reader. And I think Talley is really able to experiment with the display on the page, that formatting on the page, without losing the reader. In fact, that ebb helps mimic that relationship between these characters. And in this case, I think she's making an observation about the relationship of man, as in human, man would be human in this context, in its relationship with nature. What we get here isn't so much of a man versus nature scenario, it's man in relationship with nature, which I think is quite beautiful. What struck you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Those Girls by Joshua Croce, and it's from his collection Black Bear Creek Stories. Her first drink was straight gin, neat. Her papa worked as a serviceman for a company that made mining equipment, and he got sent all over the country to fix what broke down. One time, he came home from a trip with one of those small airline bottles of gin, no more than a shot. Her parents were born again and seldom kept alcohol in the house. So he put it on top of the Frigidaire for a time when he felt in the mood. Or her mother did. Or maybe they would split that one shot of gin in 2 glasses with tonic and lime on Christmas Eve. She was 12. She watched him put the tiny bottle on top of the Frigidaire while she sat at their kitchen table, so happy her papa was home. She decided to joke with her papa. She and her papa were always joking. "The next time you leave me here on my own," she said, "I'm going to climb on the counter and get that bottle of gin, and I'm going to drink it." Her papa stood up from the kitchen table, walked to the Frigidaire, took down the gin, and sat back at the kitchen table without a word. He held the small bottle in his hand and studied it. He set it down on the table, then slid it across to her. "Drink," he said. She looked at her mother, hoping for a way out of this joke. Her mother hung her head and went back to the dishes. "Go on," her papa said. "Drink it. I want to see your face when you learn how alcohol tastes." "Merry Christmas," the man says. She props herself on an elbow, lights a cigarette, and blows smoke straight ahead of her. "Would you like me to stay?" the man says. Her small apartment is only 1 room, 2 if you count the bathroom, but she doesn't count the bathroom. They'd fucked on the hide-a-bed. Next to them, a small fake tree's lights blink on and off. It's late, she says, though she knows she won't sleep. She'll lie awake, clenching her fists in time to the slow blinking of the Christmas lights. The man zips the fly on his khakis. He leans over and kisses her cheek because she doesn't turn to offer her lips. "I'll call you sometime." "Okay," she says. "Sure," she says. "Merry Christmas." At night, her neighborhood in Federal Way gets quiet. Her 1-room apartment perches above a garage detached from the house where the Rosaliebs live. The Rosaliebs rent her the room cheap. Their house sits on a cul-de-sac, and the garage and apartment sit behind the house, away from the road. Behind her, nothing but forest. The quiet spooks her. The nights she sits alone, all she can think about are the girls. The girls whose bodies keep turning up throughout King County. The dead girls, the nameless girls, the runaway girls discarded like spent gum or cigarette butts. What she remembers most from her papa's funeral is the shoes they dressed him in. Shiny black leather shoes at the end of his casket. She was 13, and she'd never seen Papa in black leather shoes. She'd never seen him in shoes that weren't dirty. That was half her life ago, and she still pictures the shoes clearly. She thought she would marry once when she was 17. She had just left home, left her mother and half-sisters and stepfather in the single wide tucked up in the hollows around Black Bear Creek. She left school, bought a Greyhound ticket, one way to Seattle, moved out with all she could fit in one small bag, and took the first job she could find, answering calls at the Kenworth plant. She was 17. He was 35 and a worker on an assembly line, and she was sure he would marry her. He told her he would marry her, but he was already married, and his promises meant shit. She lies in the bed and clenches and unclenches her fists in time with the blinking of the Christmas lights, and she worries. Worries about those girls discarded throughout King County, worries she could be one of them. She worries she's growing old. She worries about growing ugly as she watches the mirror. She worries about the damnation her mother told her awaits women like her. When she was in 7th grade, she would play chess with a boy from school. She wasn't very good, but he was worse. One day, the boy told her his pet lizard had babies. He asked her if she wanted a lizard when the babies got bigger. She wasn't allowed to have pets, and she knew her mother would never tolerate a reptile in the house. So she made it a home in a shoebox and hid her new pet under her bed. She had no idea what to feed a lizard, so within a few days, her mother found a dead lizard in a shoebox under her bed. And her mother took away her tape deck and all her cassettes to punish her, made her take all the posters down from her bedroom walls, and burn them in the trash barrel out back, and made her begin private Bible studies with the pastor from their holiness church. It would be in those meetings that a man first grabbed her breasts, even though she barely had breasts. The pastor didn't seem to mind. Another older man she had dated once put her in a chokehold. They'd come back to her garage apartment drunk from a party, and as she stumbled toward the door, she felt an arm around her throat from behind. She thought she was dead, but she fought. She kicked, she scratched, she flailed until he dropped her gasping on the gravel driveway. The man had run back around the driver's side of his van, then came running to her, pretending it had been some other man who tried to strangle her. Some other man who ran off into the cul-de-sac or perhaps the forest. He wanted to stay with her to protect her. Then he pleaded with her not to call the police. And he tried to force his way into the apartment after her, but she screamed and screamed until Mr. Rosalib came out and ran him off. She never saw him again, but sometimes at night she would imagine his van turning slowly around the cul-de-sac. For a while, every set of headlights that swung into her apartment were the headlights of his van. She worries she should be more careful. She worries she's only ever said, "I love you," when she's drinking. She worries she drinks too much, drinks alone too often, drinks with strange men too often. She worries. When she drinks, she remembers her papa, his smile, the way his hands felt coarse and strong against her small hands. She remembers him taking her fishing, using lizards as bait as they waded into creeks and streams, the cold water churning around her waist. She remembers the fish they caught, the way those fish tasted once Papa had gutted them and cleaned them and fried them with flour and lemon and light beer. She remembers the taste of those fish only when she's drinking. But when she sleeps, all she remembers is Papa's shiny black shoes, so she prefers to drink. The attack left her bruised. She swore she was done drinking. She swore she was done with men. Men had never done anything she wanted to remember. She had learned shorthand, and she had left the Kentworth plant for a better job doing transcription. She swore she would turn her life around, swore to swear off men and alcohol. But her promises also meant shit. She doesn't remember how old she was the last time she stole her mother's powder and lipstick, smeared too much over her face as she looked in the mirror, then tangled her mother's curlers in her hair. She can't remember how old she was. Not old enough to know what she was doing, but old enough to know she had done it poorly. Still, she wanted to show her papa. Wanted him to tell her how beautiful she looked. Tell her she was beautiful the way he would tell her mother how beautiful she looked on those rare occasions her mother curled her hair and put on powder and lipstick. But her papa didn't tell her how beautiful she looked. He laughed and made her cry. He lifted her onto his chest and consoled her, called her Papa's best girl over and over, then dried her eyes, washed her face, tried and failed to remove the curlers without pulling her hair. She wouldn't cry even though he hurt her as he yanked the curls out. She wouldn't let herself cry to protect him from the hurt he caused her. But after Papa put her to bed and kissed her goodnight and shut her bedroom door, she bawled as quietly as she could stand, clenching and unclenching her fists until her bedroom wall grew lighter with the rising sun. One of the things I like best about this story is the character development and the way that the character is developed over very restrictive page space. We're going through quite a bit of this character's life in the matter of about 5 pages. One of the ways in which Croce does this is he uses these vignettes, these short scenes or sections centered around specific moments in time. And a lot of this is focused around Christmas. So I think that's a really effective way to keep focus as we're developing this character. A series of moments where we're mostly focused on things that happened during Christmas or in that Christmas season to help create a sense of character for this girl. Another thing that's really interesting here is she never gets a name. So She's referred to she or her, but she doesn't have an actual name. She is just a girl. She is a character type. She's not even assigned a name. And I think that maybe echoes some of the anonymousness that we might feel, that I think shows up pretty much throughout her life. She seems as if she's grasping for approval that she's never going to get. Because of the religious elements, she's vying for the approval of God and those in the religious circle, and she doesn't seem to be getting that. She's vying for the approval of the father, of her own father, of her biological father, and doesn't seem to be succeeding at that either. There's a sense of anonymousness of this main character that we're choosing to focus on, which feels fractured. And I think that's something that's characteristic in Appalachian writing as a whole. In this particular story, Josh Croce is an Appalachian writer, and I think this particular story really helps exemplify that, really brings our attention to that fractured nature that exists within Appalachia and the kind of internal conflict that creates, as well as external conflicts that manifest from those insecurities. So I think this is a really effective piece to show us that, not only in terms of the way the characters develop, but also the way the story is structured. Because again, we get these vignettes, these scenes that are strung together, and we do feel that fracture and that hiccup every time we move through it. And I think part of that is also meant to show this displacement of this character. So she is originally from Appalachia, this fictitious town called Black Bear Creek. She's moved to Seattle, this big city, so she's gone from the small town girl to the big city, and also struggling to come to terms with that. So I think we get a lot of really important layers of fracture that not only develops the character and the kind of character that comes out of Appalachia, but also that physical space that she's existing in. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Making the Turn, Fostering an Inquiry Stance in Teacher Education. It's by Kevin J. Hulburt, but it's also co-written with Michelle Knotts. This is a fairly lengthy journal article, so I'm going to read the abstract, a little piece at the end of the introduction. I'll read Kevin's narrative section, and then I'll read the implication section, which is essentially their findings or the results. In this article, the authors describe how an examination of teacher candidate inquiry projects led to an examination of their own experiences as teacher, education, practitioner researchers, and competing narratives about education research. They describe how, in the process of doing research, they came to recognize how their experiences and methodological decisions impacted the process of their inquiry and the implications they could claim. Through a review of abstracts for inquiry projects created over the past 10 years by interns in a professional development school English education program, they explore how the grand narrative of educational research may affect the meaning of inquiry and how this may have implications for teacher education. They argue for pragmatic approaches that foster an inquiry stance in teacher candidates as a way to position future educators as autonomous knowledge makers who have a prominent role in education research. Narratives. Personal narratives, which look at a particular context to understand those individuals in a specific time and space, are one way to challenge the grand narrative. The researcher's positionality is significant in inquiry. Practitioners are often positioned as in the trenches, rather than in the ivory tower, or inside the academy. Polkinghorne writes that practitioners, perhaps, are better common sense epistemologists than academics. Practitioners work with narrative knowledge. As such, we offer our personal narratives here as a way to situate ourselves to offer counter-narratives to the grand narrative. Our research is, in many ways, insider research because of our experiences. These personal narratives illustrate our experiences as practitioners and shed light on how those experiences influence our work as scholars and teacher educators. Kevin's narrative. My first teaching position in 2004 was in a diverse suburban community. I sought resources primarily in the form of experienced teachers to help me respond to the differences I was seeing in classroom dynamics and needs that stemmed from this diversity. I felt able to admit I was inexperienced in this area. I was fortunate to have colleagues that were open with sharing the stories of their experiences so that I could learn from them. I was also encouraged to be innovative and try out new strategies. For example, when preparing to teach Shakespeare's Hamlet, I felt supported by my administration and teacher colleagues when I experimented with having my students learn and perform the final scene of the play in order to create engagement by inviting them to question what could lead to such an intense and violent ending. I felt clear in my reasoning for trying it as a pre-reading strategy for a challenging text, and I knew that I had the support of my professional community. Looking back now, I wonder how I would have seen these situations if my experiences took place in a time more dominated by the grand narrative. My lack of effective strategies for responding to the cultural needs of my class could have been categorized as a deficiency in my expertise, and I might have sought to hide my questions about my practice for fear of being seen as unqualified. Also, my pedagogical choices in how to introduce Hamlet may have been questioned on the academic standards that they directly addressed, or I myself may have seen my ideas as too far from the norm and sought more traditional and safe teaching methods. My understanding of what being a teacher meant, however, included that teachers are continuously in the process of identifying and responding to dilemmas that arise. I saw teachers as being always in the making, and this allowed me to openly ask for more experienced teachers' guidance without a sense that it would endanger my reputation. My first year was not, however, free from negative experiences with standardized testing and the grand narrative. For example, a representative of the county school district was sent to share with us the results of the previous year's grade level test. The scores were broken down by the standards being assessed, and we were told that the results of as few as 2 assessment items within a given standard were sufficient to make claims about our success or failure at teaching the standard. While none of us, likely including the county representative, had extensive training in statistical analysis, this call for an immediate rewriting of our curriculum seemed unwarranted, and while I was interested in discussing how we teach the concepts covered by the standard, the greater part of my reaction was defensive. The next year, I changed schools and took a position at the school that partners with the PDS, where I now continue to teach full-time. The adjustment to teaching in this community was easier given what I had learned. However, I was still continuously surrounded by important questions of practice, and again I found that I depended a great deal on my colleagues for their advice and experience. I also have noticed that the pressures of standardized testing are not as yet as strong as I have felt in my last school. I attended and still attend professional development sessions that focus on how we can improve our state test scores. However, the framing of these discussions is often to reflect upon what we currently do to teach towards the standard, with an understanding that teaching strategies are always in motion and can only improve when reflected upon. This framing allows our department to have more open discussions about what we do and what we are considering trying next. I am uncertain of all the factors that contribute to limiting the pressures of the grand narrative in this school. However, I suspect the factors include that members of the school leadership directly work to create a contested space that resists and limits the impacts of the grand narrative. After teaching in this district for 3 years, I rejoined the PDS as a mentor teacher. Working alongside interns, I have sought to foster an inquiry stance, in them as well as myself, as a philosophical approach to defining what being a teacher means. There are moments when this approach seems clear, and I feel as though I'm nurturing the sense of being in a community of inquiry that has supported me in my own teaching practice. However, there are also moments when the appealing concept of teachers as technicians, with clear right and wrong teaching strategies, overcome me and or the interns with which I work. At these latter moments, we fall into the trap of seeking easy answers to complex and contextual questions, rather than remembering that scientific results furnish a rule for the conduct of observations and inquiries, not a rule for the overt action. It is a continual challenge made more difficult by a climate of standardization that has developed out of the grand narrative, and this drove me to pursue my PhD in order to bring intentionality to this inquiry. Commonalities in our experiences. Experiences with the grand narrative. Both of us were teaching as the current era of standardization and accountability began to alter the way teaching and learning were discussed in schools. While at the beginning of our teaching careers, we felt empowered and encouraged to be innovative and experimental in our own teaching strategies, we later felt stifled by the grand narrative rhetoric suggesting that there are simple and effective best practices that we should be employing. Our experiences did not match the claims of this rhetoric. We instead found that what seems to work in one class at one time would fail in a different class or on a different day. McDonald and Shirley coined the term alienated teaching to describe instructional processes in which teachers neglect teaching practices that they believe are best suited for their pupils and instead comply with the externally imposed mandates out of a sense of deference to authority. While neither of us would describe ourselves as having succumbed to the pressures of these imposed mandates, working against them did lead us to struggles with the kinds of low morale and divestment from teaching that others suggest are connected to such compliance. Implications. Our engagement with this project has provided us with numerous opportunities to think and to rethink our own work as teacher education practitioner researchers. There is a natural appeal to identifying a problem, finding a permanent solution, and then progressing on to the next problem. However, we are in agreement with Dewey that the discovery is never made, it is always in the making. This article and any implications we address in this conclusion are not a finality of the project, but rather represent our current understandings. This research process has in fact strengthened our commitment to an epistemological stance that our goal is not to produce knowledge that leads to the prediction and control of human experience, but to produce instead knowledge that deepens and enlarges the understanding of the human experience. In our continued work with teacher candidates, we intend to engage in a process of trial and error as we seek to foster an inquiry stance in future practitioners. For now, we see some possible approaches that may foster this stance and help interns to position themselves as practitioner inquirers. The first way to foster this stance may be to challenge the grand narrative through awareness and introduction to alternative methodological narratives. This was especially useful for us in our graduate course, and we see its merit for pre-service teachers as well. We see great potential in introducing students to the wild profusion of research methodologies that defy homogenization and standardization. Students can see new possibilities for their inquiry topics, the process, and potential products and outcomes. An introduction to other methodologies will help them to move beyond the constraints of the grand narrative and to recognize the value of experience, collaboration, and other ideals of an inquiry stance. What Lather hopes for in the training of education researchers is similar to what we hope for in teacher candidates who engage in inquiry. To be able to negotiate across standard procedures from many paradigms to engage with the uncertainties of knowledge toward more nuanced thinking. Our students will be working within schools impacted by the era of standardization and accountability, making them aware of the grand narrative and fostering recognition of how it impacts their practice may help them to negotiate it in order to maintain their professional autonomy. Another approach we see as helpful for the development of an inquiry stance is in teaching to read pragmatically. Cherry Holmes asserts that researchers have been pragmatists all along, choosing community and a way of life, and choosing our future as we have described and explained our past, but that we have not been pragmatic at all in our arrogance and presumptive search for certainty as we have tried to get things right. We would suggest that this universality of pragmatic action is even more apparent in the work of teachers. Teachers are continuously surrounded by the instabilities, uncertainties, terror, and responsibility inherent to the educational enterprise. We believe that fostering experiences for interns with the textuality of research will help them to see researchers as collaborators in the inquiry process. Viewing research from this lens would prepare teachers to read research for ideas that relate to their own inquiries, ideas as potentialities, not prescriptions. The two approaches described above have potential for reminding teacher candidates that the notion of inquiry as stance is distinct from the more common notion of inquiry as project, which treats inquiry as a time-bound project or activity within a teacher education course. We see inquiry as a way to prepare future educators to position themselves as knowledge makers in the profession. We agree with Cochran-Smith and all that developing and sustaining an inquiry stance is intended to be a lifelong and constant pursuit. We see this as a goal for our students and for ourselves. When future educators engage in a collaborative community of inquiry, they take ownership of the role they do play in their classrooms and can play in the wider discourse of education. As researchers, our recognition of the contradictory nature of writing an article through our original approach compelled us to seek a different approach that recognized our relationship to the data being studied, maintaining a recognition of the complexity and nuances of that relationship. We also recognize that our first endeavors to write in a way that is in alignment with our experiences as practitioners and as teacher educators. We are opening ourselves to criticism from the grand narrative, as well as those that have already made similar leaps to working in other narrative methodological streams. However, we found this approach to be inescapable, as we sought to speak from our own truths. It is our hope that by exposing the process of this piece and our struggle to negotiate within the dominant discourse of the grand narrative, we can illustrate the challenges of maintaining an inquiry stance, and in so doing, provoke further discussion on how to meet these challenges in teacher education. One of the things that I like best about this piece is its use of narrative. It does make sense in terms of content to include those personal experiences from the writers, but it does defy the norm. Generally, in articles, in academic and scholarly articles, we don't tend to include too much personal experience, but story is something that an average everyday audience can hang on to. It's something that we can relate to. It makes difficult and complex ideas a little bit easier to digest and hang on to. And I think that rule is still true here too. This is a collaborative piece, and one of the most challenging things to do when you're writing collaboratively is to smooth out that voice, to make sure everything sounds consistent and cohesive. And I think the authors do a really good job of that. So in the places where we need to hear the collective voice, they do that seamlessly. And when we need to hear their personal experiences, when that collective needs to diverge, that makes sense too. There's not a huge hiccup. And I think the overall organization of the piece helps contribute to that sense of cohesion. We get them as a collective first, then we experience them as individual writers, and then we come back to them as a collective. So we are very much in a conversation with them on the page. And I think that's a really clever way to engage a reader, especially in something like scholarship. Unless you're a teacher, you generally don't read pedagogical scholarship. And so I think this is a really good starting piece for someone new to the fold. What struck you about this piece or another piece by these authors or this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called So You Want to Be a Bureaucrat: 3 Easy Ways to Navigate the Red Tape by Gerome Q. Banks. This is a blog. I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction, and then I'm going to jump down to his 3 easy ways to navigate the red tape that he gives us. So you want to be a bureaucrat. You've often wondered about a career in federal government. Maybe it just seems too hard, too complicated, too cloak and dagger. Perhaps you're a little apprehensive about breaking through the red tape, navigating the hiring process, or leaving the familiar grind of the private sector. Let's face it, there's not a ton of readily available information out there illuminating how to land a federal job. Of course, the government's uniquely bureaucratic challenges extend to the hiring process, which some find overly complex and confusing. But with the right mindset and tools at your disposal, navigating the red tape like a roadmap to get your government gig is entirely attainable. Exercise some of the tips below to lift the fog and land your first job in civil service. 1. Master USA jobs. Because most federal agencies, except many intelligence agencies and some other accepted service agencies, think Central Intelligence Agency, Federal Bureau of Investigation, National Security Agency, U.S. Postal Service, etc., are required to use USA Jobs. This job board interface is like the virtual gatekeeper of federal job vacancies. Clearance Jobs provide a pretty good list of agencies that aren't required to use USA Jobs. You'll have to search up those agencies' vacancies separately. However, for most intents and purposes, mastering the USA Jobs search and application process is the linchpin to finding the right government employment. But to know USA Jobs, you must first understand that your resume has to navigate a series of automated and in-person wickets. The first USA Jobs hurdle is the search criteria. So we just need to get in there and poke around. Discover alternative locations, keywords, filters, hiring paths, and more. You might just find something unexpected, but if not, keep looking. Positions open and close all the time. One proven way of keeping up to date is with the site's search and announcement save functions. And when you do find a potential job match, and eventually you will, don't rush the application process. Applying on USA Jobs requires intention and thoughtfulness. Read the announcement carefully, paying special attention to keywords and knowledge, skills, abilities, and education. You'll need to incorporate this information into your resume to maximize chances of making it beyond the automated screener and initial manual HR specialist chop. Of course, this only gets you through USA Jobs and hopefully forwarded to the agency for their review and interview process. Remember, interviewing is a perishable skill, so be sure to practice it. 2. Take full advantage of hiring paths and other authorities. There are a number of hiring paths from agency internal to veteran, recent graduate, individuals with disabilities, public, and many others. Actually, I wish I had known about and understood federal employment and USA Jobs as an undergrad student and recent graduate. The opportunities for internships and entry-level positions are limitless, especially for a recent graduate who might be more inclined to relocate than other job seekers in different stages of life. In fact, many student and recent graduate opportunities at the entry level will nearly automatically promote to the next grade for 2 to 3 years until the employee reaches the full job performance level, some even to management positions. Other important paths and authorities that give job seekers a competitive edge include disabled veterans, military spouses, individuals with Schedule A disabilities, tribal affiliation, and other special authorities defined in federal hiring regulations. These, along with direct hiring authorities, will differ across agencies, locations, and career paths. Actually, this is a great opportunity to highlight that the government is currently desperate to fill several mission-critical career fields in high demand across the government, including mathematics, engineering, human resources management, contracting, auditing, economics, nursing, sciences, IT management, and cybersecurity. So whatever hiring path you're eligible for, make sure you take full advantage of the many opportunities and allowances that USA Jobs presents. 3. Try federal contracting. Finally, maybe you haven't had much luck on USA Jobs or haven't yet found the right opportunities to break through. Try contracting. Federal contracting is quite different from federal employment, and you don't want to confuse the two. In many cases, contracting can be much more lucrative, but is also significantly more unstable. Many contracting organizations can't play well past the execution of a contract, and contract renewals are never guaranteed. However, getting a federal contracting job can be a precursor to doing similar work in a related organization. That is to say that I've known lots of contractors who were hired as federal employees doing the same work in the same government office that they did as contractors. Others make positive impressions in the federal government by building strong and professional relationships with government employees. Sure, this may be the long way around, but it works out well for many, many people and should not be discounted as a plausible path through the red tape to a long-lasting federal career. So one of the things that I really like about this piece is the way that it uses subsections to demystify this really intimidating process. We're given 3 easy steps to help us navigate the red tape. 3 seems pretty manageable. It's not overwhelming, and the way that he sums it up makes us feel like we can accomplish it. So when we're communicating to a digital reader, it's really important to be concise and brief because they may not hang in there with us for the whole time. So he gets his points across really, really easily, and they're really important points. So when you're a digital job seeker, those online job forums and announcements are really important. So if you're looking for a federal job, his first stop is USA Jobs. That makes sense for hiring to these government agencies. I think we can apply a lot of this information to a general job seeker as well. For really any field, most announcements are placed on some sort of job site or job board. So for example, if you want to do university teaching, then most of the time you're going to look at higheredjobs.com or the MLA job lists. But really with any kind of specialized field, they're going to have some kind of job board that they use more often than others. So getting familiar with those systems is really important. And it means you have a wider range of access to potential jobs, things that you can apply for. But you also have a lot more competition in a digital space. So one of the things that he really highlights is thinking about your keywords when you're composing your job materials. That means looking really closely at the job call to try to identify keywords that you can fit into your job materials, whether it's a resume or a CV, and these 2 items are different in the US. If the job call is asking for a resume, that means they're expecting a 1-page document and no more that outlines your credentials and qualifications for this position. So it means you need to do some work in order to think about what accomplishments and job experience that you have and skills that you have are best going to appeal to that employer. If they're asking for a CV, then you can exceed 1 page, and you should. This gives a really long record of all of your accomplishments, your awards, your job experience, and things like this. But a CV doesn't have a skills and proficiencies section. And really in the skills and proficiency section in a resume sort of allows you to ping that system a little bit more easily to get through that red tape. With a CV, you're going to have to work some of that verbiage into probably your current projects that you're working on in that section. Another thing that he tells us that we should consider is thinking about hiring paths and other authorities. So who do you know? Who can put in a good word for you, and what kind of relationships have you made already in this environment? Things like recommendations and your references are really important here. And finally, he recommends contracting. While yes, it is unstable, it can be something that can help you get into something that's full-time or more sustainable. If you're interviewing for a contracting position, a limited time appointment, or freelancing, one thing you can do when you get an interview is to ask if this position has the potential to become something full-time. And then you'll know upfront either way, and that helps you make a decision as well. But taking advantage of contracting and freelancing opportunities is one way to get your foot in the door. It's also a way to help you figure out if this is an avenue that you really want to take. Is this something that you're going to enjoy without being locked in by some other kind of contract? So contracting is a good way to help kind of ease your way into this, to see if this is something that you like or if it's something that you're proficient at. Thinking more about the blog style as a genre, one of the things that I really appreciate about this piece is the way the introduction is set up. Banks acknowledges a potential problem or anxiety that we have, and he uses that as a catalyst to grab our attention to get us to keep reading. Also, I'm a fan of the title. It echoes Bukowski's So You Want to Be a Writer. In this case, we get So You Want to Be a Bureaucrat. These are some of the things that I really appreciate about this particular piece. What struck you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Shopping Habits by Shaun Turner, and it's one of his nonfiction pieces. Each year, a symbolic gesture, the president pardons 2 turkeys. Last year, President Obama granted 2. Tater and Tot the stay. This year, Donald J. Trump Pardon, Drumstick, and Wishbone. Together, the four will live the rest of their lives on the campus of Virginia Tech to be able to gobble among the other lucky ones. Like many symbolic gestures, the meaning is cloudy. In this grocery store, hundreds of headless turkeys shoulder each other in plastic bags, their innards stuffed down their throats into what chefs call the cavity. A woman lifts one bird after another in both her hands, and her eyes narrow like all she knows is the heaviness of this bird. That this bird is here to cook every year for the holiday dinners. Kroger's too big now. There's a furniture section and racks of clothes, and the light is gray like department stores. If it weren't for the train of other shoppers billowing past me, it could be any time at all in the gloaming. 2 p.m. or 8:30 a.m. or midnight. The air is cold, smells like the inside of a refrigerator with its bulb burnt out. Behind me, a lady picks a plastic can of Folgers from a big display wheelbarrow. I look for something sweet. I miss the Kroger I used to know. Its harsh fluorescent lights. How time slowed there. How different from each other, yet tied by hunger at Kroger. So many people wait in one checkout line, the 15 or less, though a few have several items. Quiet at last, and together in our weariness, we are kind and sympathetic to the cashier. It's one in this line on its too short conveyor belt, our bags straining our shoulders. We do this to make time for tomorrow. We know in and outside our line. It is already tomorrow. Each of the few people around, the checker and the white-headed woman behind me, says it looks like it's about to flurry outside. To me, to each other, even though this has been true for hours. And it's cold, I add. We say this to each other in almost a conspiring way, as if to confirm that the outside and the inside are all things that are true. Just earlier, I drove across town in the mist somewhere between rain and ice. I sat in the Kroger parking lot and read Facebook statuses, watched as people went in and out with their bags. I sat there and the radio changed to an hourly news update. I switched it off. The rain had quit, and I rolled my windows down and lit a cigarette. Birds dove into puddles. Cars kept sloshing by. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. It was like something saying, someday soon, you will wake up and make coffee without this worry. You will be able to go to the grocery store without this particular fear sitting in your heart. I'm relying on strangers, on us, to recognize each other, even if it's small things first. In the checkout, we made small talk and shivered together in the plush aisles, underlit like we were in JCPenney. A bird found its way in. It was uneasy there, in the sterile space we made. It hopped the grocery store rafters and tweeted. A young employee watched it go, his hand absent-minded over heart, brushing for one moment his blue vest. One of the things I really like about this particular piece is the way that Shaun takes a really mundane experience or location and intensifies it to develop characters. The grocery store makes a perfect contact zone for all of these different personalities to interact with each other. In this, he highlights the ritual aspect of going to the grocery store. In this case, we participate in this ritual in order to get sustenance, literal sustenance, food. And we all must do it. We can't escape it. It's a necessary thing we must do, go to the grocery store. And we're getting quite a bit of analysis about these characters or with these characters, showing their kind of commonality. And at the end, we get kind of a turn. We don't necessarily know until that point that the narrator is struggling to be in those kinds of environments, both in a state of hungry, in a state of proximity with others. There's an anxiety to all of it. Not even the narrator escapes evaluation in this piece. And that kind of vulnerability endears us as a reader. It takes a lot of trust to be that vulnerable. And the narrator outright acknowledges that in the piece, as if to say, this is my olive branch. Now you do your part. And I think that is another way of demonstrating the kind of communal living, the kind of communal expectations we have in Appalachia of ourselves, of each other, and our environment. And the story is told through these fractured vignettes that might also demonstrate the sort of fractured state of being within Appalachia, this quasi-insider, outsider position that we hold, a kind of ambivalence that exists within the region. And to make it all make sense, to tie everything together, to create cohesion, we get the frame with the turkeys and a recognized ritual. So these are some of the things that struck me about this piece. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called A Mother Near the West Virginia Line Considers the Public Health by Julia Spicher Kasdorf from her book Shell Play, Poems, and Photographs from the Fracking Fields. The industry thinks I'm too dumb to back down. They don't know I do this for my mom and dad. They were 69 and 71. He had pulmonary fibrosis, worked with asbestos all his life. She grew up near the coke ovens, back when kids were sent into the mines to pick coal. So they both had lung problems. But their home, the next hollow over, sits 350 feet from a compressor station. We sealed the house, set up an air scrubber, but 4 of their neighbors passed last year too. We bought the coal rights to our 115 acres because we know the company will come right up to your front door. But we let the gas rights go. Just didn't see this coming. A gentleman from New Jersey leased our land. One day, we come home to find pink ribbons tied in the field, then bulldozers. They put in 4 shallow wells and a Marcellus well on a 5-acre pad 700 feet from our porch. The workers come in by the busload. All those strangers on our land 24/7 could have been rapists or pedophiles. For about a year, they didn't have a portage on. I looked out my window one morning to a guy peeing in our driveway. The dog brought in used toilet paper. The workers have to be young, strong. Kids in trucks 12 to 16 hours a day. That should be a placard. Hazardous waste. They live on junk food. I know because we pick up the wrappers. Then our dog disappeared. We saw Sarah's tracks in the snow go right up to the well pad. When the crayfish died in our spring, we knew the methane had migrated. Now you can light it on fire. Our neighbor put in a water line. We guessed their well had gone bad and they'd settled, but they paid for it themselves. We had water buffaloes 2 years before we paid to run a line in from the road. When they laid the gas pipeline, those big trucks drove over our water line and busted it up. When I hollered at the drivers, I got dragged into court. Me and our son, 4 years old then, both got an injunction. They tried to say I'm an unfit mother too, but the judge wouldn't hear it. I look at pictures of my little one from that time, and he has the same dark circles under his eyes as the Hollowich kids. He'd get terrible stomach pains. Nothing we could do but hold him. My older boy had the nosebleeds and rashes. I couldn't keep him inside all the time. I'll show you pictures. If you speak up, you get more security. We had guards here 24/7, armed and unlicensed in Pennsylvania. They got real interested in my walks down by the creek. One asked me, "What do you do down there in the evening?" I said, "I walk, and I have pawpaw trees. Want to come along?" He could have used the exercise, so he walked with us, and I got to know the night guard. His mom was sick the same time mine was. We're still in touch on Facebook. They drilled the gas pipeline on a weekend. Didn't go where the DEP said, so it blew out our creek. Bentonite and residue waste clouding. Clean water stocked with trout. That's when I cried. That creek flows into the Mon, and people get their drinking water out of that river. Another side effect of the drilling no one thinks about is all the swearing, and it's not just the men. Alternate waste disposal on site means they can bury radioactive drill cuttings in your land. When they drain the fracking pits, They shook the tarp and bulldozed the sludge into the ground, too. There's places we mow now, but we don't feed that hay to our horses. I can't dig or plant a post there. Why don't they tell us not to grow food or let beef graze back there? The stock sale registers animals now. So if I sell the hay to a neighbor, he sells his steer, and someone's sick from the meat, that comes back on me. People collect royalties on this well a mile away. We just care for the place and pay taxes. The well tenders come about once a week, to shallow wells, and every day to the Marcellus. 2 or 3 times a week, water trucks come in here and draw brine, and every 2 weeks they blow it down. So whatever's on the line goes into the air. Once the brine tank vented for 45 minutes. My horse's eyes swelled shut, and one eye went blind. They've had the nosebleeds. There's a big gum tree near the well that loses its leaves in the middle of the summer. We saw clouds of silica sand blow off train cars over the Little League field, and someone was holding a newborn there, with us in the stands. When I complained about them parking silica trains by the elementary school, the gentleman said, "It's just sand, your kids play in it." We didn't have the internet before this. You have to follow the permits because the industry tells you nothing. You have to go to the courthouse and pull your file. When you find out what they did to your land, you're just sick. Let them think I'm too dumb to back down. My son won't play on any t-ball team with industry logos on their shirts. Something that I really like about this particular poem is the positioning of the audience and the narrative I. So we're essentially peering in on a conversation that the narrative I is having with this woman who's at the West Virginia line. So it's a very intimate space, and we get information that we maybe wouldn't be privy to if the audience that she was speaking to was larger. This takes on a very conversational tone, and this helps accentuate some of that language and dialect used in rural regions, especially in the Appalachian area. And there's also a fair amount of repetition in here too. Nosebleeds keep coming up. This seems like a relatively innocuous thing, but we know that this is part of the larger iceberg. So this hints toward that larger issue caused by destructive industry in rural areas, especially in Appalachia. So then those nosebleeds begin to carry a lot more weight, and they become a kind of code. And codification is something that we rely on quite a bit in rural Appalachia. And part of that, I think, probably stems out of the tension and oppression before the mine wars. And it's something that seems to carry over generationally. And I think that last line, "My son won't play on any t-ball team with industry logos on their shirts," that's of huge significance. Within insular and rural communities, they tend to rely on each other to sustain. So that community effort to keep the business going is critical. However, these fracking and coal industries are not small businesses. They're quite big. But in her own way, she's taking a stand here. She's not going to allow her child to be a billboard and exploited through those means. And if these organizations, if these companies don't have community support, it will become difficult for them to exist within those spaces. So right now, it might be something that perhaps a company might laugh off and not take seriously, but over time, those moves have an eroding impact. So these are some of the things that I think are really special about this particular piece. I really like the whole collection, and I think if you're teaching in a rural area, especially in Appalachia, this is something that students really connect with, because they can see these locations and these spaces, and they can hear these people, they can see them in their mind because they grew up with them and they grew up with that environment. So when you can take the mystery out of it, especially in an introductory kind of course, it helps them see the patterns more clearly. So books like this are really important, that focus on the local, that focus on the agricultural, that focus on that tribe setting where every body matters, every person matters in order to sustain that community. And also, the women in this book, they cause a fuss, they make a stir. They are not silent martyrs. They are very active makers and activists for their communities. And what you don't see is anytime I do a conversations with writer video, I've always got this book with me. It's something that gives me a little bit more confidence in front of the recording light of doom. Thinking about the kinds of challenges these women overcome helps me put my own fear and anxiety in perspective. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Life as We Know It by Michael Bérubé. Bérubé is a scholar, but he also writes creatively. And this is an excerpt from his memoir, and it's part of the introduction. My little Jamie loves lists. Foods, colors, animals, numbers, letters, states, classmates, parts of the body, days of the week, modes of transportation, characters who live on Sesame Street, and the names of the people who love him. Early last summer, I hoped his love of lists and his ability to catalog things into lists would stand him in good stead during what would be undoubtedly a difficult vacation for anyone, let alone a 3-year-old child with Down syndrome. A 3-hour drive to Chicago, a rush hour flight to LaGuardia, a cab to Grand Central, a train to Connecticut, and then smaller trips to New York, Boston, and Old Orchard Beach, Maine. Even accomplishing the first of these mission objectives, arriving safely at O'Hare, required a precision and teamwork I do not always associate with my family. I dropped off Janet and 9-year-old Nick at the terminal with the baggage, then took Jamie to long-term parking with me while they checked in, and then entertained Jamie all the way back to the terminal via bus and shuttle train. We sang about the driver on the bus, and we counted all the escalator steps and train stops. And when we finally got to our plane, I told Jamie, "Look, there's Mommy and Nick at the gate. They're yelling that we're going to lose our seats. They want to know why it took us 45 minutes to park the car." All went well from that point on, though, and in the end, I suppose you could say Jamie got as much out of his vacation as might any toddler being whisked up and down New England. He's a seasoned traveler, and he thrives on shorelines, family gatherings, and New Haven pizza. And he's good with faces and names. Then again, as we learned toward the end of our brief stay in Maine, he doesn't care much for amusement parks. Not that Nick did either at 3. But apparently one of the attractions of Old Orchard Beach for my wife and her siblings was the small beachfront arcade and amusement park in town, which they associated with their own childhoods. It was an endearing strip, with a roller coaster just the right size for Nick. Exciting, mildly scary, but with no loop-the-loops, rings of fire, or oppressive G-forces. We strolled among bumper cars, cotton candy, games of chance and skill, and a striking number of French-Canadian tourists. Perhaps the first time our 2 little boys have ever seen more than one Bérubé family in one place. James, however, wanted nothing to do with any of the rides, and though he loves to pretend drive and has been on bumper cars before, he squalled so industriously before the ride began as to induce the bumper car's operator to let him out of the car and refund his 2 tickets. Jamie finally settled in next to a train ride assigned for children 5 and under, or thereabouts, which, for 2 tickets, took its passengers around an oval layout and over a bridge 4 times. I found out quickly enough that Jamie didn't want to ride the ride. He merely wanted to stand at its perimeter, grasping the partitions with both hands and counting the cars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as they went by. Sometimes when the train traversed the bridge, James would punctuate it with tiny jumps, saying, "Up, up, up." But for the most part, he was content to hang on to the metal bars of the partition, grinning and counting. And when the train came to a stop, pulling my sleeve and saying, "More, again." This went on for about half an hour, well past the point at which I could convincingly share Jamie's enthusiasm for tracking the train's progress. As it went on, my spirits began to sink in a way I do not recall having felt before. Occasionally, it will occur to Janet or to me that Jamie will always be disabled, that his adult and adolescent years will undoubtedly be more difficult emotionally, for him and for us, than his early childhood, and we will never not worry about his future, his quality of life, whether we're doing enough for him. But usually these moments occur in the relative comfort of abstraction, when Janet and I are lying in bed at night and wondering what will become of us all. When I'm with Jamie, by contrast, I'm almost always fully occupied by taking care of his present needs rather than by worrying about his future. When he asks to hear the Beatles because he loves their cover of Little Richard's Long Tall Sally, I just play the song, sing along, and watch him dance with delight. I do not concern myself with extraneous questions such as whether he'll ever distinguish early Beatles from late Beatles, Paul's songs from John's, originals from covers. These questions are now central to Nick's enjoyment of the Beatles, but that's Nick for you. Jamie is entirely suis generis, and as long as I'm with him, I can't think of him as anything but Jamie. I've tried, almost as a form of emotional exercise. I've tried, on occasion, to step back and see him as others might see him, as an instance of a category, one item on the long list of human subgroups. This is a child with Down syndrome, I say to myself. This is a child with developmental disabilities. It never works. Jamie remains Jamie to me. I even try to imagine him as he would have been seen in other eras, other places. This is a retarded child. And even this is a mongoloid child. This makes for unbearable cognitive dissonance. I can't imagine that people might think such things, but I cannot imagine how they might think them in a way that prevents them from seeing Jamie as Jamie. I try to recall how I saw such children when I was a child, but here I guiltily draw a blank. I don't remember seeing them at all, which very likely means I never quite saw them as children. Instead, I remember a famous passage from Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations. Seeing as is not part of perception. And for this reason, it is like seeing, and then again, not like. Reading Wittgenstein, I often think, is something like listening to a brilliant and cantankerous uncle with an annoying fondness of koans, riddles. But on this one, I know exactly what he means. One of the things that I really like about this piece is how it engages with a larger imagined conversation. I think the purpose comes across really clear here, and what Bérubé's larger memoir tries to do is dispel some misconceptions about disability and start engaging with disability studies in a narrative way. So I think story is often one of our more compelling forces for persuasion. It also helps us understand and digest really complicated or complex concepts a little bit more easily because we can assign concrete features to them. We just hang on to story better. So I think pulling out this situation or this trip with a kid that has Down syndrome really helps us understand what that means and what that's like. In a lot of ways, when Jamie is young, he's not that much different from other kids. He likes going and doing things like other kids, but his enjoyment with them are for slightly different reasons. And the things that he finds most enjoyable about them, the way he's engaging with them, are slightly different. So he might not actually want to ride the ride, but he enjoys the counting and the activeness of the ride itself. Being on that periphery, being on the outskirts seems to be where he's most comfortable and observing. And I think the author, Bérubé, does a really good job of using that listing as a way to tie the threads together for this piece to keep us moving, to keep us going, and to make this excerpt really effective. Not only is listing something that's vital for Jamie, it becomes vital for this story as well in these moments to help connect everything, to create cohesion. And that shows a really deep understanding of not only this child, but also the conditions in which he survives. We even see the author attempt to categorize the way that society does, and that moment is particularly heartbreaking as the language that we use to categorize becomes more uninformed. And we do see the narrator, Bérubé in this case, because it's nonfiction. We do see the narrator engage with that, try to understand it, try to study it, try to find value in it, and then ultimately reject it. These are some of the things that I find most interesting about this piece. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Disposable Hero by Camille-Yvette Welsch, and it's one of the poems that we talked about in her Conversations with Writers interview. Disposable Hero for Elizabeth Fernandez, MD, June 25th, 2020. We mourn our own on Facebook Live, a tribe in plastic coveralls and goggles, waiting for the next call as we say goodbye via cell phone. None of us more corporeal than the next. The only real body, our former wellness guy, lowered into the ground. Two men stand beside it, neither able to touch each other. At the hospital, I talk to my sister through layers of plastic, the crackle of bag against my face, the constant sweat slick of mask on goggles, on plastic bags, on phone cover, and she still manages to deliver a smile to me. When I am smiling, she hears it in my voice, the last muffled part of me still public. 2 streets over from my house, people crowd tiny tables along the curbs, the humid air between them no thicker than my arm, and they stew in it as they bang their pots and cheer for the doctors, their leper heroes, every night at 7. Bang the pots and screw the masks. They swim in their steam of togetherness, the virus blooming like bee balm, the funeral wreath that wraps around their heads, then winds to the next person and the next. Sometimes people call us to collect their nearly dead, to witness what they cannot. The patient with a DNR, delivered by ambulance. We watch her drown in the virus, rise to the surface again and again, try to break for breath, only to watch the pressure of her own lungs pull her down. How fiercely the body will rise, even against itself. Zippered into our plastic suits, we watch as someone's loved one gasps and shudders to death. A morphine drip can lessen the pain, but not forestall the final suffocating wave. The darting eyes still looking for help. I watch in tears, and my resident turns to me and says, "I didn't think these things affected you like this." At home, my child grows, learns to sit up, to squawk and babble. My husband and I must decide if I am to be banished. The face at the window, the smile in the screen. Square mommy, her voice slightly slower than her mouth. Her arms, a phantom, less real than the stuffy in the crib. He's too young, I say. He's so young. I used to use my hands to calm people as I told them no. Nothing more could be done. Now I use my hands to intubate the dying. I use my hands to count this week's dead, the call times of the deceased. I use my hands to call families and explain what we have done and what we could not do. I have counted up from 1 ICU to 4. I have counted the number of coworkers lost, the days in the same PPE, the people too scared to touch me. I count a few I call friends, who I call when I can't remember who I am beyond plastic, and gloves, and call times, and stripping in the basement, then laundry, then shower, then Lysol, then deciding what parts of who I am are disposable, and to whom. One of the things that really draws me to this piece is its intensity. The anger and frustration builds as we move through the poem, and the author accomplishes this through listing, an intense listing that starts to build up steam. Occasionally, that gets subdued or controlled or attempted to be controlled, but by the time we get to the end of it, we know why Fernandez is so frustrated. We understand disposable. Camille gives us these really vivid descriptions that helps us see the conditions in which this medical professional exists in. While being praised for helping and being part of the solution and giving care, she can also see the disaster that's going to happen and exacerbate the situation. This is one of the things that leave healthcare workers in a constant state of stress and strain. And that becomes very clear in the poem itself. Not only is Fernandez under immense strain work-wise, when you're pulling, 10, 12-hour, 16-hour, 18-hour shifts, and perhaps you're doing them back-to-back, not only is that a huge strain and stressor, but then there's the emotional labor that goes into this too. Not only watching them die, being there for those who are dying, but also their family members. It is just a lot for anyone to take on. And while people are celebrating in the streets, it doesn't feel like medical professionals are being honored. It feels like they're going to end up with more work. And they did. And it's that juxtaposition of celebration and internal conflict that we see from the healthcare professionals that creates this tension and shows or highlights the difference in ideology and values. I think that last line hits us pretty hard, and it's earned. What struck you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. With permission from Palinka Pictures and Pearl, I'm going to show you the trailer for The Turnout, Pearl's award-winning movie. At the time of filming, The Turnout is free to watch through Amazon Prime, but you can also rent or purchase the film. Let's watch the trailer.
You said that you only used just to stay awake. And 2 years later, you're still using.
Working really hard at it. What the fuck, Jimmy?
Your whole life on the road is a party.
Anybody looking for some good company tonight?
I'm not high.
That's kind of stupid shit stoned people say.
I think right now the most important thing for you is to be there for your daughter.
Everyone knows she's trailer trash.
You know what that's about, right? That's for helping young girls who have been forced into prostitution.
But he forces these girls to be whores?
You think these girls wake up dreaming about sleeping with a couple of ugly old men like us?
There's good money in it for them.
Listen, I'm not stupid. When I took this place over, it was nothing but a whorehouse. You need to stay away from them people. That's bad news.
There's something seriously fucking wrong.
I know you're scared.
I've had enough of this shit. I don't know what to do.
You can start by helping her.
So, how you know Nevaeh?
A brief summary. This movie is about human trafficking, and our main character is Crowbar. We follow Crowbar pretty closely throughout the movie, and we learn as he learns about human trafficking. Fair warning, there will be spoilers. One of the things that I like most about this movie is it addresses a misconception about human trafficking. We often think of human trafficking as something that happens far away, when in reality, human trafficking is most prevalent in impoverished communities with very little job opportunities or mobility. And unfortunately, a lot of that happens in Appalachia. This movie takes place in a rural community in West Virginia. Crowbar is a truck driver. His marriage is not going so well. He has a tumultuous relationship with his daughter, so he hides out in work and drugs. This is how he comes into contact with Nevaeh. We find out that Nevaeh actually attend school with Crowbar's daughter. And Nevaeh is working as a prostitute. She's being human trafficked by her family. Given her closeness in age to his own daughter, Crowbar's attitudes start to shift. He no longer looks at her as a prostitute offering services. He now looks at her as somebody who needs help. So he attempts to do this. He investigates the family, but he does this as someone who is purchasing drugs. And I think this close reliance on Crowbar's perspective, where the audience is closely aligned with Crowbar on his particular journey, we don't know more than what Crowbar knows at any given time. So we're discovering not only what human trafficking is, but how it exists in his community, along with Crowbar. For me, there are two major scenes that really continue to stick in my mind. One is with Nevaeh's mother, between Nevaeh's mother and Crowbar. Crowbar confronts Nevaeh's mother, June. We want to hate June. We want to dislike her. How could she let her child, her children, become part of this? How is it that she seems to be sanctioning this behavior, orchestrating it even? And we have the same disdain that Crowbar seems to have. But there's a moment where Crowbar gets aggressive, not to hurt June or anyone else. He's just angry at the situation. But June, we get the sense she sees where this escalation could potentially go, and she's going to protect herself and her family. She holds a shotgun up to his face, and she says, "You don't know me." And she's right. We don't know her. We don't know her situation. We don't know the kinds of challenges that she has to overcome on the daily. We don't know anything about her daily reality. What we come to realize is that Crowbar has made some assumptions, and so have we as the audience. June is living in a very patriarchal society with very rigid roles and expectations. She doesn't have a lot of opportunity. She doesn't have a lot of mobility. If she leaves this family structure, which is largely orchestrated by the father, Boyd, where is she going to go? Where is the money going to come from? How can she take both of her children? These are questions she doesn't have answers to, and she has limited resources. So the best that she can do in this situation is try to control who her daughter comes in contact with. She can screen the men that are going to pay to fuck her. She can make sure that at the very least, it won't get her daughter killed. If she's there supervising, she can at least stop anyone from killing her or hurting her, scarring her more than what's already been done. She can try to minimize the damage, and that's about the best she can do. No mother is going to want their daughter to be a prostitute or sell drugs. So the best that June can do is supervise. And the second moment that sticks in my mind is when Crowbar is talking to Boyd, Nevaeh's father. Charlene, the youngest daughter, maybe 6, 7, 8 max. They're in the living room and she's playing with something on the coffee table, not really giving too much mind to the conversation occurring between the adults, which is mostly about drugs and prostitution. Boyd wants to thank Crowbar, so he gets Charlene's attention and he says something about how we thank someone, how we show our gratitude. He's now grooming this girl, this small child, elementary school, 6, 7, maybe 8. He's now grooming her for prostitution, his own kid. And in that moment, Charlene looks at him, and when he repeats the question or the insinuation, how do we thank someone? How do we show our gratitude? There's an understanding on her face, and she looks away. Down, her shoulders sink. It is a devastating moment. There are no actors except for one in this movie. They are all survivors of human trafficking or truck drivers. The only actor is Boyd. That moment is so effective because that 6, 7, maybe 8-year-old has lived it. These are some of the things that stick with me from this movie. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Pianoforte by Lisa Croce. If you'd asked me before, I wouldn't have told you mornings were the most magical part of my day. I suppose it's not the morning's fault. But when you're outraged, you blame places, people, articles blindly. Because, well, do I need to spell this out? You're outraged. And I'm not talking fender bender on your way to work outraged. You see, I was outraged because I'd awoken in someone else's body. When I opened my eyes that morning, it was bright as hell in my room, like there was a spotlight pointed at me. The too bright type of light that should have alerted me something was very wrong. Instead, in my ignorant, sleepy fog, I wrenched an arm out of the cocoon of covers, reaching to the nightstand. I was in search of the post-it note I wrote on the night before, a habit my yoga teacher had recommended to help ease my anxiety since the COVID-19 lockdown. My wrist began contorting this way and that, feeling around, but instead it thwacked into what felt like a plastic iceberg. Then a noisy crash to the floor. I flinched and heard pills scatter on the wood. It would have taken an hour to reorganize them again. Shit, I said. The echo of a deep voice reverberated off the bedroom walls back at me. I instantly screamed. I angled my eyes around the room, nothing out of the ordinary. A large sleigh bed made of mahogany wood, the oriental rug Vivian and I got on our 25th anniversary trip to Santorini. The roll-top desk I'd inherited from Aunt Sylvia, velvet curtains framing the double windows, a view of the treetops from Prospect Park. I screamed again. The same low rumble echoed off the walls. Who the hell was Vivian and where was I? A second ago, this room felt worn in, like the vintage pair of Levi 501 jeans I'd found uptown. Not an item out of place. But now it all felt very, very wrong. Like trying to hike up a wet swimsuit. I'm a woman, I said. I felt a little foolish, but needed to make the declaration. This announcement might have been funny in another context, but if you hadn't already guessed, waking up in an old white man's body will snatch the humor right from you. I looked down at the two wrinkled hands clutching the duvet and sharply sucked in air. I attempted to jump from the bed, but my body wouldn't hasten and my back felt as if I'd been thrown from a horse. I wondered if I'd accidentally eaten an edible before bed. What the hell? I whispered. His voice was withered, tired. I'd heard about a reaction from an edible once via some dude that my bestie Tiana had been bucking. She wouldn't bring him out to the bars with us because his voice sounded like a creepier Terrence Hayes, though. So I never actually met him. Just then, I noticed a large mirror above the dresser. I built up the courage and placed a veined hand on it, lifting my body into view. If I were in my own slender female body, I'd be on the hardwood by now, bowled over by shock. But instead, I heard laughing in my head. Get on with it, I said. This time, the low timbre of his voice didn't scare me as much. I was beginning to feel his emotions, though their heft was still mostly underwater. I could feel he was losing patience with me, at my hesitation, urging me to rip the Band-Aid before I lost my nerve completely. I was handsome in my day, he said to me. Many girls wanted me to court them. Now he was just bragging. But as I considered him in the mirror, I noticed there was truth to his boasting. I could see he was probably once a handsome white guy behind the wrinkles, the receding hairline of silvery wavy hair, the slight yellowness to his teeth. I felt the tug of the bathroom. I let him take over the horrid task of relieving himself, as I crawled as far inside my consciousness as I was able. I did not want to be scarred for life. I ambled through the house in his procedural way now, filling the French press and setting it on the stove, retrieving those nightstand pills from the Iceberg and choking them down with what tasted like rancid tomato juice, cracking 2 eggs into a pan, smearing jam on toast, and chewing slowly, so slowly. As I overchewed and caffeinated, I thought about my own tasks for the day that I now wouldn't get the chance to complete. I needed to record and upload videos of me performing my original songs on piano to my YouTube page, then to my TikTok. And finally, I had Mackenzie's and Lucas's piano lessons over Zoom that afternoon. I began to tidy the kitchen. My sturdy fingers thrusted open a card from a woman named Ellie, addressed to Dad. Inside the card, there was a photo of Ellie's daughter, Violet, posing with another young woman. The two were embracing, arms locked around each other, one girl, Caucasian, holding out a hand with a modest gem on her finger. The other young woman had a skin tone like mine, a gorgeous black girl like me. I dropped the photo to the counter, as his body realized the young women were an engaged couple. I could feel he wasn't pleased by their relationship, but it was the color of her girlfriend's skin that concerned him more. Anger swelled in me, and I raced to the living room looking for something, anything to exact it upon. A delicate porcelain lamp sat stoically on a wrought iron glass top table. I flung myself at it, swiped an arm across the lamp until it crashed to the ground. I hunched over to catch my breath, triumphantly scanning the room for more sacrificial relics. And then I saw it. Atop the piano, in the far corner of the room, I noticed a framed photo. I crossed the room and gripped it tightly, smoothed a finger over his face so close to Vivian's. I wonder why he was allowed to have a marriage if Violet and her fiancé couldn't. Yet the longer I was with him, the more I began to understand his thoughts. Not relate. I'd never relate. It's not right, he thought. How will they have children? And they'll have an easier life if they're with someone that looks like them. I could feel how open-minded he believed himself to be amongst his elderly peers. You're misunderstanding me, he said, making me out to be the bad guy. But the truth is, he'd probably never see it. And there was only one way to force empathy from him, to shove him into pain in order to level the playing field. I lifted his wedding photo, at first simply inspecting it. I felt his body stiffen against me. I felt grief wash through him. Then suddenly, I slammed the frame to the ground, the glass splintering, shards flying at me. His hands began to rip at my face. And then, without warning, my hands were thrown at the keys of the piano. I still don't know if it was me or him who was responsible for it, but I'm sure it doesn't matter. Because what I didn't understand that day, blinded by anger and my own pain, was that those who hurt, hurt. And if we hurt, for the spite of hurt's sake, much like an eye for an eye, we are all blinded and pained. But that day, I wasn't ready to learn a lesson. Not yet. Instead, I sat on the piano bench and mourned my freckled cheeks, my textured hair, my gorgeous brown skin. I wanted it back. I'm not racist, he said. Stop thinking that. I stared at his hands until I was ready to place them back on the keys. I began to play. Debussy's Clair de Lune was the first melody that came to mind. My hands took over. If I closed my eyes, I could drown out his words and lessen the pain. In that fleeting moment between slumber and awake, I used to think about Vivian. I cringed and braced myself for pain that washed over me like a deluge. Vivian is gone, but the pain stopped there. That should have been my first clue. The pain that usually comes from my joints and body never came. But like a starving boy, when bread falls off a truck, you don't ask how, you simply eat. The realization that I didn't wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom hit me next. Men sail through most of life, body-wise. I realized this years ago. Knew how lucky us bastards had it. Plus, Vivian would tell me at any chance she could get. But when your prostate gets ornery, let me tell you, you're done for. No one spoke about this, you probably don't care, whoever you are. But that morning in my bed, my eyes bulged and I immediately lifted the top sheet. I prayed I didn't find a soaked mess. My surprise, the sheet, along with my pajama bottoms, were dry as bone. This was another moment I should have realized I was not in my own body. Did she tell you her story already? Anyway, that morning my body felt stronger than it had in years. I launched myself out of the bed. It only took 2 steps toward the mirror before I fell on my ass from getting cocky. Youth was wasted on the young, but getting old just makes you bitter. And when I lost Vivian, the race to bitter quickened. I stepped to the mirror. She was a slip of a thing. The body I was in. A pipsqueak, we used to say. All limbs and hair. Immediately, I felt her pull. But not the pull of her willing moving me around. Her pull toward the future. Getting older. Experiencing life at a faster pace than it was doled out. The recklessness that youth affords, sparking against any object, like kindling. I walked too slow for her, too carefully. Before I could stop it, she was touching several pieces of technology, and music began blasting out of some portable speaker. She wanted to dance, to spin, and twerk, apparently. But then, just as quick as she demanded we move, she picked up her phone and got lost swiping upward with her thumb. During these moments, she seemed to lose chunks of time, but I was fully aware that there was a perfectly good Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle not getting done. I looked around for any printed books in the apartment. Not many. If there was one, it had some celebrity's name attached to it. You know they don't even write their own books, right? They're called ghostwriters. My apartment is my slice of heaven. Can you stop judging me, Grandpa? By now, as you could see, I was very aware that I was a hostage in a millennial's body. Or is this what it would feel like to live in senior care? That was my worst fear. I wanted to go out in a glorious stroke, or drop dead and have that be the end of it, kaput. The thought of being bound to the will of others in a body that has a mind of its own without relatable agenda, reminiscent of right now, tore me up inside. Would Vivian have needed to be cared for had she been diagnosed early enough for them to do anything about her glioblastoma? Or perhaps I was in some decrepit home at that very moment, wasting away, staring out a window in a wheelchair whose wheels stayed locked by the aides. You're overreacting, she said, tucking some of her curls into a coral-colored hair wrap. Those homes are nice enough. My Nana is in one, and it only sometimes smells like pee. She turned in the mirror, inspecting herself. I tried to ask her how often she visits her Nana, but that question was averted as we went into the bathroom to begin what she described as her face routine. My mama told me to start young, she said, massaging foamy soap into her cheekbones. She seemed somewhat comfortable with me along for the ride of her day, as if her schedule couldn't be halted in order to figure out how we'd gotten swapped. So your Nana, I tried. Do you miss her? Back in front of the mirror, she was stretching in preparation for yoga. She bent down to touch her toes, exhaled loudly. I don't want to talk about Nana, old man. She bent to the other side. I lost my wife not so long ago, and I've been thinking a lot about where I'll end up, I say, wondering if my grandkids would come visit me. By now, she was sitting on a mat on the floor, incense burning in the background, a steel drum track on the speakers. What do you want me to say? She lifted a leg onto the other into some flowery named position. I don't know names here, folks. Nana was good to me. I miss her, she said. She opened her eyes. I caught a glimpse of her in the mirror that was angled down at the floor. Her eyes glistened. The last time I visited her, she didn't know who I was anymore. It wasn't the home that smelled like pee. It was her. It can't be easy to watch someone you love disappear right before your eyes. But don't you think you should visit her again once COVID is over? On some level, she'll know you're there. Clearly, I've overstepped. Said too much, as I always do. Vivian would scold me our whole marriage about that. And maybe she was right. Perhaps her Nana doesn't know who she is. Each visit a technical waste of her time. A subway fare deducted from her Metro card. And what for? If no one was there to mark your presence, were you ever really there? That's how life without Vivian felt now. When I looked up toward the mirror again, she was rising from the ground, and we were walking to her secondhand piano keyboard. As she sat at the bench, I could see it was a Roland F30, a very good digital piano in any decade, mine or hers. There's an apparatus clipped to a standing lamp. Somehow, I instantly know this is where she records her music and videos. The more time I've spent with her, I was able to then feel that music, out of all the other things. Celebrity autobiographies, yoga, even her facial routine. Music was hers and no one else's. A calmness came over her, and I sat, waiting to see what she would do. But her hand stayed on her lap. A soft whimper began to come from her. You really think I should visit Nana when this stupid-ass pandemic is over? She sniffled. Instead of answering her, I lifted her hands to the keys. This, right here on these 88 keys, both black and white, like the two of us, is where we connected, I realized. We could argue about her Nana, the volume of her music, but hands outstretched on this keyboard, these pedals underfoot, there wasn't a thing in the world we had to disagree on. Then it hit me. A song that would make Vivian smile no matter how big our fight, how loud our shouting matches got. She'd enter the living room, suppressing a smile, standing behind me, hand on my shoulder, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. I played on, slowly as Gershwin himself demanded, until I felt the edges of my host's lips curl to a defiant smile. I love this song, she said. How did you know it would make me feel better? Because, honey, I said. That's what it was created to do. What I really like about this piece, and I think Amy Alvarez probably said it best during our interview last year, there are many threads dancing. And this is another piece that has many threads dancing. We are opening a discussion about race, about sexuality, about gender, and about generational gaps. So this is a lot for one short story to sort of manage. And the way that Croce does this is through turning that adage, walking a mile in someone else's shoes, on its head. And with fiction, we have that kind of flexibility. So this is sort of like a Freaky Friday that gets complicated and goes beyond the surface, asking not only the characters to go deeper, but the reader to go deeper too. And it's an interesting positioning because we get both perspectives, the woman and the older man. And we come to understand their stories by their dialogue to each other internally as they're sharing the same body. And then also externally, the audience gets acknowledged too. So there's an expectation that someone is listening beyond these two characters to each other. It's almost as if they're giving witness testimony through the layers of details that we get and the way that they're delivered. So in this way, this Freaky Friday, this body snatching is kind of positioned as a crime, but we don't quite know who the culprit is, and that doesn't matter. And I think the use of music is really important here. Not only are we given that indication through the title, but both characters begin to connect through their understanding of music. So while they are very different and have very different ideologies, very different values, the one point of connection where they can begin to hear each other and have a conversation is through art, through a shared interest in a specific type of art. And while Croce doesn't force a message onto a reader, I think that message, we can easily infer it there. Ways in which we can come to understand each other, and perhaps art might be the best catalyst to get us there. So these are some of the things that I found most interesting about this piece and that I really love about it. What strikes you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. This is called Breaking the Iceberg, Ernest Hemingway, Black Modernism, and the Politics of Narrative Appropriation by Walter Bosse. This is from his dissertation, so his early scholarship. I'm going to be reading the abstract and a few bits from his introduction that helps establish the argument and set the stakes for that argument. This project redresses the scarcity of literary criticism that deals with the fictions of Ernest Hemingway in relation to Black cultural productions of the 20th century. Building from a post-colonial theoretical framework, it establishes a historicized dialogue in which African-American authors such as Langston Hughes and James Baldwin strategically confront, appropriate, and repurpose Hemingway's modernist narratives. This dialogue dramatizes my conviction that Black writers of the Harlem Renaissance and post-Renaissance decades were tactically reading and resisting modernism's central texts in ways that can be seen to anticipate critical deconstruction. Reading Hemingway through minority discourse thus gives this project a new purchase on his aesthetic choices. At the same time, it complicates and augments existing theories about influence, ingenuity, and the power in 20th century African American literature. A strikingly small number of literary critics have attempted to place the work of Ernest Hemingway in conversation with the cultural productions of 20th century Black artists. This dissertation addresses this gap in the criticism and takes it as a historical and theoretical imperative to spotlight, describe, and analyze intertextual moments where Hemingway's fiction converges in fascinating and problematic ways with the expressive realm of African American culture. This study proceeds from a methodology that recognizes a complex network of strategic appropriations taking place between mainstream modernist writers and emergent voices in the Black tradition. I've decided to place Hemingway at the center of the study for a number of reasons. The first obtains from the historical reality that his fiction was wildly successful and widely published during his career, and has remained readily available since his death in 1961. Under these conditions, his work has always been materially accessible, a prime source of up-and-coming writers during and after the period of cultural modernism. Given the increasing production and consumption of cultural objects in Black communities in the early decades of the 20th century, I find it intriguing that so few critics have explored Hemingway's work in that context. Secondly, Hemingway's literary aesthetic is in large part dictated by deliberate minimalism that involves omission, elision, and erasure. Thus, his narratives supply fascinatingly complex material for other writers seeking to use them for their own distinct purposes. More than perhaps any other modernist writer, Hemingway's narrative craft is one of absence. His stripped-down prose provides for an illusion of clarity, though it remains highly ambiguous and uncertain. Therefore, in the chapters that follow, moments of semantic and aesthetic ambiguity in Hemingway's texts figure as the primary point of appropriation. In the process of rewriting those moments, the Black authors give them real political weight. The appropriations thus illustrate that African American writers were actively participating in a kind of critical reading and reconstruction of modernism's central texts. In a sense, they politicize the apolitical narrative, making something out of nothing, as it were. Third, in my critical estimation, the field of Hemingway studies has remained largely committed to an exceptionalist view of the author's modernist craft. In other words, barring a number of important studies that I build upon in this dissertation, there has persisted a troubling tendency amongst scholars to perpetuate Hemingway's own assertions about his work, that it is clear, concrete, and objective, and that these attributes set him apart from the complex and uncertain culture of modernism in which he lived and wrote. Referring to the limited number of post-structuralist approaches to Hemingway, critic Scott St. Pierre has recently and rightly pointed out that many readers take Hemingway's transparency for granted. In this dissertation, I hope to cast suspicion on this prevailing myth of transparency. Reading through a historicized intertextuality, this study seeks to enhance the current conversation about Hemingway by locating and analyzing a set of appropriations that involve his fiction, which occurred decades before the critical industry surrounding his work. It is important to clarify that in their use of Hemingway's fiction, these Black authors can be seen in part to practice what Henry Louis Gates Jr. calls signifying, revising with a compelling sense of difference based on the Black vernacular. Since I rely upon appropriation as an operative term throughout the study, it is also important to distinguish the forms practiced by Langston Hughes and James Baldwin from the prevailing forms of modernist, primitivist borrowing practices by white artists, which, as I will discuss in a moment, often involve racist and imperialistic gestures. However, I would also contend that Hughes's and Baldwin's methods of interpreting and redeploying Hemingway's fictions go beyond the act of signifying that Gates describes in The Signifying Monkey. To varying degrees, the Black vernacular is indeed vital to their social and artistic ethos. However, their engagement with Hemingway's work has far more than linguistic implications. For example, given Hemingway's stature as a literary celebrity in his own time, and given the values that his author image alone would invoke, to signify his work is also to infiltrate and unhinge such discursive constructs as hypermasculinity, heteronormativity, and nationalism, among others. Thus, my approach recognizes that African American modernists were performing post-structuralist theories about identity and resistance many years in advance of their explication by critical theorists. In a sense, their narratives constitute a variant on the deconstructionist imperative. They reveal the inherent instability of Hemingway's texts by targeting and destabilizing the privileged terms that dictate the structure. However, their readings and rewritings of Hemingway's texts go beyond merely demonstrating the aesthetic and semantic uncertainties that constitute them. Hughes and Baldwin use Hemingway's ambiguities as opportunities. They tactically usurp the textual contradictions and used them to expose the inherent instabilities within prevailing structures of power, structures that are predicated upon notions of racial and sexual difference. The African American texts in my study become avenues that offer new access to the problematic politics of representation in Hemingway's prose, and therefore allow us to gain a different critical purchase on the author and his fiction. Their narratives play on the semantic and aesthetic ambiguities in his work. They transform those textual moments, and they give them political balances. Prescient commentators on modernist art in their own historical moment, Hughes and Baldwin, circumvent the myth of transparency that has beguiled so many of Hemingway's critics. They point up the fascinating and confounding complexities in his narratives and fashion politically active art from politically inert ambiguity. Thus, this study redresses the scarcity of criticism that deals with Hemingway in relation to his Black contemporaries, at the same time that it enhances our understanding of influence, ingenuity, and the power in the African American literary tradition. This study seeks to build upon and depart from the criticism that focuses on race strictly within his fiction, letters, and manuscripts. I am thus interested in exploring Hemingway's politics of representation by way of an intertextual approach, and the purpose that his texts become objects of appropriation and rewriting in the hands of African American artists. Given this emphasis on creative confrontation and ideological resistance, this study employs a post-colonial theoretical framework in constructing the dialogue between Hemingway's texts and the Black modernists who actively read and repurpose them. Yet still the question remains, why Hemingway? Wyndham Lewis claimed in 1934 that it is difficult to imagine a writer whose mind is more entirely closed to politics than Hemingway's. So why would Hughes and Baldwin turn to his work when their own artistic pursuits were so deeply invested in the socio-political conditions of modernity? There are, I believe, many answers to this question. The first seems obvious. Hemingway was a famous writer, and his fiction was widely available to anyone who desired to read it. Self-evident as this claim might seem, it nonetheless merits some exploration, if only to establish the larger context for Hemingway's popularity. During his own lifetime, his first novel, The Sun Also Rises, 1926, sold over 1 million copies. His short stories were published in an array of periodicals before making their way into collected volumes and anthologies. Critic John Rayburn notes that Hemingway published 5 books between 1925 and 1930, and all save The Torrents of Spring received enthusiastic notes. Indeed, the availability of Hemingway's fiction in the first half of the 20th century is perhaps exceeded only by the availability of his image in the popular media. Speaking to the same year in which Lewis issued the above critique, biographer Michael Reynolds acknowledges that by the time Hemingway was 35, he was a newsworthy figure whose every public act was grist for the media. His broad shoulders, his round, mustached face, with its pronounced widow's peak, had become as widely recognized as some movie stars. Reynolds goes on to point out an interesting reversal that further evidences the power of Hemingway's persona. Where once his fiction drew attention to his active life, now that life drew attention to his writing. It would certainly understate the claim to say that Hemingway was a celebrity in his own time. However, in spite of the deliberateness with which the author managed that celebrity image, his legacy as a pop icon is not all dictated by a singular unifying ethos. To be sure, Hemingway's author image has multiple, often contradictory faces. In his study of Hemingway himself as a fiction, as a popular representation, David M. Early sees the shifting registers of the author's identity as a consequence of the popular genres that featured him. He appeared as a blood and guts soldier in the adventure magazines and as an expert and lusty sportsman, drinker, and traveler in the bachelor magazines. And as a celebrity, he filled the pages of the tabloids. This popular representation of Hemingway as both serious author and public figure, sensitive artist, and masculine ideal has often been overlooked in both biographies and critical studies. But his reputation has as much, if not more, to do with the construction of Hemingway as a masculine role model in the popular press as it does in his work. Thus, Hughes and Baldwin would have encountered Hemingway's fiction at the same time that they and every other American would have experienced the development and evolution of his mythos in the popular media. This is not to belabor the de facto claim that they would have read his work as a matter of course. Rather, it raises the stakes of their appropriation. Given Hemingway's iconic status as a living legend, and given the cultural values and ideals attached to him, to signify on his work is to also access and potentially disrupt such discursive constructs as masculinity, heteronormativity, and nationalism, among others. Tracing these appropriations thus reveals that we are not dealing with one writer influencing others. To the contrary, this intertextuality has more to do with iconoclasm than it does with influence. Whether or not Hemingway's mind was closed to politics, as Lewis would have it, is a somewhat different matter. However, what is central in each of the following chapters is the critical recognition that Hemingway's modernist aesthetics are driven by contradictory impulses, and that at the center of the aesthetic contradiction, there exists a moment of profound socio-political significance. Miriam B. Mandel shrewdly observes that the contradictory needs to affirm and deny, to reveal and conceal, show that Hemingway's texts are as unstable as any postmodern work. I would, of course, concur with Mandel's observation, but I would also add that she is not the first reader to discern this instability. This returns us to the original question: why would Black writers choose to appropriate Hemingway's work? I want to emphasize that though this framework places Hemingway's narratives in a position of historical primacy, I do not intend to posit a unilateral structure of influence, nor to suggest that their secondary uses of his work are in any way acts of artistic homage. To this end, my critical goal partly resembles Michel de Certeau's imperative in The Practical of Everyday Life, which is to bring to light the clandestine forms taken by the dispersed, tactical, and makeshift creativity of groups or individuals already caught in the nets of discipline. Pushed to their ideal limits, these procedures and ruses of consumers compose the network of an anti-discipline, consuming, appropriating, and redirecting the cultural objects disseminated by the elites producing the language. Black modernists were strategic readers who carved out their aesthetic and socio-political subjectivities from the materials that were ready to hand. In this way, their acts of reading and rewriting can here be seen as moments of both artistic and political opportunism. Their interpretations qualitatively transform Hemingway's narratives and in the process displace the authority of the text. A different world, the reader's, slips into the author's place. Articulating the discrepancies in Hemingway's texts, Hughes and Baldwin's engagement with mainstream modernism thus registers as both creative and critical work. In a sense, their narratives perform according to a specific deconstructionist imperative, to demonstrate the inherent instability of a text by revealing and subverting the privileged terms that dictate its structure. However, as my chapters show, their creative deconstructions involve more than a demonstration of textual uncertainty. As critical enterprises, Home and Giovanni's Room use Hemingway's ambiguities as opportunities. They tactically usurp the textual contradictions and use them to shed light upon the inherent instabilities within prevailing structures of power, structures that are predicated upon notions of racial and sexual difference. Proceeding from the view that Black Americans inhabited an internal third world, and that their subjectivities were constrained by political and juridical forces, we necessarily sustain the sense of socio-political urgency that motivated Hughes and Baldwin to create art that engaged the operative power structures in the U.S. Appropriating Hemingway is thus a means to an end. Theirs are deconstructions that extend beyond the active analysis, because they actively critique the socio-political discourses they confront. As Gates and Said both established, there are always particular resemblances that manifest in the minority or colonized text as it responds to the first world cultural productions. Indeed, the resemblance is itself constitutive of the act of resistance. In this way, the appropriations operate similarly to the colonial mimicry that Homi K. Bhabha describes as both resemblance and menace. The menace of mimicry is its double vision, which in disclosing the ambivalence of colonial discourse also disrupts its authority. In disclosing the troubling ambivalences in Hemingway's aesthetics, the minority voices in this study actively and performatively engage in critical projects that theorize about identity and enact forms of ideological resistance. In spotlighting these transactions, this study is in part an alternative reconception of Hemingway's critical legacy, as well as an alternative reconception of Black modernist writing in the 20th century. Indeed, Said writes that the act of resistance itself offers another way of interpreting human history, and that it is particularly important to see how much this alternative reconception is based on breaking down the barriers between cultures. In my view, the dearth of criticism dealing with Hemingway in relation to Black artists is evident that such a barrier continues to linger in the Academy. When Toni Morrison marvels at how much apart Hemingway's work is from African Americans, she inadvertently perpetuates this racialized division within the study of modernist American literature. Like many Hemingway scholars, she takes something for granted, not only in the purview of his aesthetics and body of work, but also in the large dialogic context where 20th century minority writers were consistently and strategically responding to his fiction. This study thus seeks to build upon the vision of inclusivity and exchange set forth in the work of such scholars as Anne Douglas in her Terrible Honesty, Michael North in The Dialectic of Modernism, and George Hutchinson in The Harlem Renaissance in Black and White. Though the titular objects of study include Hemingway and Black modernist writers, I want to argue for the continued contemporary relevance of this study's critical framework. If Morrison's attention to Hemingway is any indication, his influence still looms large, to say the least. Houston Baker Jr. defines Renaissanceism as a transhistorical term describing 20th century African American literature. Renaissanceism connotes something quite removed from a single exotic set of failed hijinks confined to less than a decade. It signals, in fact, a resonantly and continuously productive set of tactics, strategies, and syllables that takes form at the turn of the century and extends to our own day. From Hughes to Baldwin to Morrison, Hemingway's fictions occupy a fascinating position within the set of tactics and strategies that Black writers used and have continued to use to carve out artistic and socio-political subjectivities. In what follows, I articulate these exchanges and theorize their impact on the study of American literature. One of the things that I really like about this piece is the way that it reminds us of the stakes of the argument, and I think that's one of the big challenges in scholarship writing is, why does this matter? What is at stake with this argument? And Walt finds ways to reinforce that throughout the piece as we move through each explanation of each aspect of the argument that he's making. So we're constantly getting that reinforced. Why does this argument matter? He's filling a gap. There's an aspect of Hemingway that no one's talking about in comparative literature when they talk about Hemingway and contrast those works with somebody else. Another thing that I find really interesting about this piece is the way he juxtaposes texts within the same time period. Normally in comparative literature, we're going to the way back texts and then butting them up against contemporary texts to show an evolution or some other kind of argument, sustainable argument that we want to make through time. Here, he's using one of the most famous authors of his time, Hemingway, and juxtaposing his work against contemporary writers, African American writers of that same time, and talking about how Black authors are sort of using what Hemingway sets up to carve out their own political identities and creative identities within this space. And I think it's really important to include that really detailed description of Hemingway's perception in his own time so that non-Hemingway scholars get a sense of the gravity of what we're working with here. So I think that's really important too, because that makes this kind of piece that's quite dense and goes through a lot of texts, comparing them to each other to talk about narrative appropriation, modernism, and politics. There's a lot going on. So having these concrete aspects in here makes this more accessible to someone who isn't a Hemingway scholar or who isn't a comparative lit scholar. So I think that makes it far more accessible. I also think that Walt brings up a really important point about the dangers of iconoclasm. So basically deifying a writer and taking them at face value about what they say their work is or does, because writers are human and they are flawed, and sometimes they have an incorrect assumption about themselves or their own writing. So it is really important to engage with that process of inquiry to get a stronger sense of the reality of the picture. While Hemingway might use very simplistic language and phrasing and sentences, he is by no means transparent and clear. And I think as a creative writer, it's really important to read comparative literature scholarship because it gives you a sense of what scholars are thinking and writing about and what they're picking up on creative pieces. So while the vast majority of the authors that Walt is discussing are dead or long dead, there are many writers and many opportunities to talk about living writers and their work. And if you as a creative writer want your stuff to be taught in colleges and universities, taking a look at comparative literature and lit theory and thinking about how to demonstrate those concepts through imagery and language can help kind of increase your chances that a scholar who is also teaching might decide to make your book or piece part of their syllabus. So this is another way to get airtime, is to read some of the scholarship and think about ways in which you can use language and imagery in order to demonstrate those concepts that they are seeing in other works. How can you pull these things forward in contemporary ways? This, again, not only increases your chances that something like your book will get picked up and studied in an academic setting, but it also creates more depth to the things that you're writing, which just in general makes it more interesting for a reading audience. So these are some of the things that I really like about this piece. What struck you about this piece or another piece by this author? Tell me in the comments below. Thank you to all of the writers who participated in the series this year for donating the most precious thing any of us have to give, time. I continue to use the strategies you shared with me to generate and revise my own work, which has produced a lot of exciting publication success for me over the last year. Again, thank you so much for sharing your strategies and philosophies. Thank you to Logan Venderlich for creating original music for the series, which continues to foster a sense of tone and atmosphere for each video. Thank you to everyone who likes, shares, comments, and subscribes. And of course, thank you to everyone who watches. I and fellow writers participating in the series appreciate all the ways in which you extend your support. That's it for this year's retrospective. See you, love you, bye!